Thank you for staying with us. You're watching Business Unusual with me, Tami Ngubeni. I'm in for Ayabonga Tsawe today. It is Mama I Made It Friday, and I'm in conversation with Sizwe Nxasana, the board chairman for the National Education Collaboration Trust. Now, just before the break, we were talking about issues of ethics and leadership, and you know what needs to be done in order to redress that. But I want to go back a little bit to a point I made when we started our conversation, that I actually thought that you would have gone for teaching if accounting was not your first option, because you are now actually teaching in the Future Nation schools. You actually stand in front of a class and you are an educator.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it's the best thing I've ever done, actually, in my life, to be very honest. I teach grade 8, 9, and 10. I teach EMS, which is accounting or economic management sciences. I teach leadership. I teach, entrepreneurship, because we've got to create and produce job creators, as opposed to teaching people to go and look for a job. And it is one of the best things I've done. But one of the important things, especially when we talk about the future, the 21st century learning and teaching process, is to ensure that we can connect the real world with what happens in the classroom. Because, you know, going forward and even now, schooling shouldn't just be about the production or consumption of knowledge. It should be about the skills and the competencies that allow young people to navigate this fast-paced and fast-changing world, which is digital, in which we live. And therefore, you know, it's really important to bring teachers in the classroom that have been on the other side. In other words, that have worked outside the teaching environment. Because often, especially if you follow the kind of teaching methodology that we teach, which is project-based learning, where we bring, you know, a lot of projects from grade 1 right up to, you know, FET grades. Projects that are developing these skills that are really important about collaboration, about critical thinking, problem solving, in addition to, of course, integrating multidiscipline in terms of how the teaching process actually, you know, takes place. And today, you know, we spend a lot of time, for instance, running workshops for the public schooling system, or even for some of the universities, around multidisciplinary teaching and how that actually happens in the classroom, because this is the way that teaching for now as well as the future should be happening.
It's really about the application of knowledge. That's where the real power comes in. Knowledge in itself is just there, it's latent, but when you actually apply that knowledge, that's when you start seeing the real results. But you know, you also had some input on the National Development Plan 2030. Tell us a little bit about that and how close or how far we may be to achieving that ideal.
Well, if you look at the NDP, I mean, it's a great document. Yes, it does have gaps, but actually the creation of the NECT, the National Education Collaboration Trust, and now the Nxasana Student Financial Aid Program, ISFAP, recognizes that government on its own can't solve all of these societal problems that we face in the country. And for civil society, for labor, to come on board in solving some of these problems. And the NDP created a really beautiful framework for us to be able to do that. So that's how, you know, in 2013, when it was adopted by government, it made it possible for the NECT to be created. We now work, as I said earlier, in about 2/3 of the public education system, and we're trying to develop exactly the same kind of model when it comes to higher education. Because we know, as an example, the TVET colleges need a huge amount of fixing, because, you know, we have 50 TVET colleges in the country. The curriculum, the way of learning and teaching that takes place in the TVET colleges, in fact, needs to be overhauled as a matter of urgency. Our universities are doing quite well, but, you know, with the massification of university education, especially with the benefit that's now accruing to a lot of our young people, it is important that we improve the quality of our university system as well. So I'm really privileged in that whilst I work in the private education space, I also work with government in some of these areas that are critical in our education system. For instance, the migration of early childhood development from the Department of Social Development to basic education. We are doing that and helping government through the NECT do that. We're running the National Reading Campaign for the country. In other words, we all know that our children are not reading for meaning, especially, you know, by grade 3 or age 10 or grade 6 or 9. And we're working with a lot of stakeholders, private sector, the NGOs, to drive the National Reading Plan in the country that's going to improve the ability of our children to read for meaning. That includes developing learning and teaching material, developing, for instance, indigenous languages in terms of the material that should be available for our children to read, training teachers on how to teach reading, because we can't assume that someone is a teacher, and therefore they know how to teach reading, as an example. So there are a number of areas that range from policy to practice to innovation that we're working in government to support the improvement and the growth of our economy in our country.
Now, before our time ends today, I want to backtrack a little bit. We've spoken a lot about what you're doing now and how your past has actually influenced your present and where you're going. But let's backtrack to about 1989 when you first established Sizwe and Co, the first black-owned audit company in KZN at the time. How was that for you? And then subsequently, Nkoki, Sizwe and Zaluba. Tell us about the challenges that you faced at that time and what you were going through in that period of your life.
Well, these were deep days of apartheid, where as black people we were not allowed to have companies for starters. So our initial forays into accounting, as an example, we were, helping township, business operators, shopkeepers, and so on. We were helping professionals like doctors and lawyers. And when democracy arrived in 1994, suddenly the fortunes of some of us who had started these firms, these professional firms, changed because there were now opportunities where government, our democratic government, was giving us a lot of opportunities to audit and do consulting work for state-owned companies, for state-owned entities, government departments, and so on. And that allowed our firms to grow. That's how we were able to establish these firms as national firms, or even as international firms, which Sizwe and Zaluba Kuboto Grant Thornton is now an international firm. And the root came from, having a government that believed in us as young black professionals at the time. And when you look at what's happened since then, the opportunities opened in the country. That's why I ended up at Telkom. I was at Telkom for 8 years, having the privilege and opportunity to lead that entity. And then I went to banking. And for me, all of this has been about lifelong learning, that all of us can teach ourselves new skills or competencies. And often we're too scared to take ourselves out of a comfort zone into something that we may not have known about before, but all of us can actually do it.
You pointed to government being a huge factor in your success because they provided the landscape and the environment for you to be able to succeed. Are you confident that that is still happening? And are those opportunities being adequately utilized, for the benefit of not just a few, but for all, and also to set a precedent then for not only other auditors, but in other professions as well, for black professionals to succeed?
A lot more has been done, but we must concede that a lot more still needs to be done. We just take the legal profession as an example. I mean, it's really a pity that even these days, when you even look at some of the state cases, for instance, you're going to find very few black advocates, as an example, that are representing the private sector, and sometimes even government for that matter. So there's still major issues when it comes to some of the black professional areas getting recognition and support to meaningfully participate in this economy.
Let's look at KPMG and such companies that have actually brought the entire auditing industry into some disrepute. What can be done in order to put auditors and the profession back to its former glory, to be trusted as you were?
I'm really privileged, again, to be part of this profession, the accounting and auditing profession. And I'm also privileged that I've been involved in, as some of us have major concerns, obviously, on what has happened. You mentioned KPMG, the VBS scandals, and some of the other issues that we faced, which have really tarnished our profession, accounting profession. And I'm really pleased that I've been part of the transformation process to really put the profession back to where it was as a profession, really, which is highly regarded throughout the whole world. We now have a new board of the South African Institute of Chartered Accountants, which follows the principles of King Code of Corporate Governance, as an example. In other words, it's not just accountants talking to themselves about themselves. The oversight process is really, really important. And the second thing that's happening is the revision of statutes and bylaws, especially those that are supposed to discipline the members that are getting out of line. So those are currently under review. And thirdly, the work between the regulator, in other words, IRBA, which regulates those that perform the audit function, the attest function, and the members that fall under the South African Institute of Chartered Accountants. There's a huge amount of work there. For starters, to make sure that those members that have been found wanting are dealt with speed, with the kind of discipline that is required. And secondly, that the standards, we talked about ethics earlier on, the profession is now working with universities, with schools, to say ethics actually must be taught. And the standards of corporate governance, the standards of discipline, all need to be taught in university, at schools and so on. But also there must be consequence management when it comes to those people who fall out of line.
And those really need to be, I think, the cornerstone in all industries. But we thank you so much for your time this afternoon. You're doing a lot, and we're looking forward to seeing what more you will be doing and contributing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was Sizwe Nxasana, the board chairman for the National Education Collaboration Trust. Now, it is a wrap from the Business Unusual team for this week, and we'll be back next week with more business news and sector insights between 1 and 2